Hey, what's up, tribe? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the TFC Audio Project Down Under. This episode is all about habitat. We chat through the human relationship to habitat and how that has changed over time, the extreme importance of habitat for our health and well-being, and some strategies to optimize your environment and experience of habitat in your daily life.
This week's episode is sponsored by TFC Events. We're stoked to finally be heading off this week to tour our brand new Feet, Balance and Play workshop over the next fortnight. We can't wait to catch up with the tribe down south after a bit of a COVID hiatus. Our first stop is Sydney for 2 workshops next Saturday on the 27th of March. In the morning, we'll be at Fitness Culture in Bondi, and in the afternoon, we'll cross the harbour and head to Movement HQ at French's Forest. The following weekend, we'll be in Melbourne for another workshop on Saturday, the 3rd of April at CrossFit Soul Rebel in Thornbury. That'll be followed in the afternoon by a natural running workshop hosted by fellow foot nerd and mate Mick Breen. There's still tickets available to all of the events. To book your spot, follow the link in our show notes or head to the events tab on our website at tfc-shopaus.com. We can't wait to see you all there.
All right, you're back with James and Mac, and this episode is going to be all about habitat. So this is heavily inspired by the chapter on habitat by Frank Forencich in his book New Old Way, which is one of the required readings for the Footnote program and is now one of our favorite books of all time.
Big time, yeah, massively.
It's a very, very, very powerful book, and he touches on a lot of different topics, and not to summarize the whole book, but it's all about the sort of dichotomy between the old way or the ancestral way of living and the new way or the modern way of living, and how we can sort of take the best of both worlds and apply that to our own lives.
And it's a way I think he puts it as well. He has a way of writing, Frank, that it seems so simple, and the way he explains things just makes so much sense. And it's not like it's new information that you're hearing for the first time, but when it's put into the context that he puts it into, it just makes so much sense.
Yeah, and that's the power of good writing, I suppose, and good story is it might not be necessarily new information, but yeah, the way in which it's expressed can be very powerful and can really hit home. And I think for both of us, that book has really hit home in a lot of ways. And yeah, we're pretty excited to take, the cliff notes or the main points and chat about them and get it out there, but also highly recommend reading the book and getting the book yourself.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So in the spirit of that, we'll start off the podcast with a little excerpt from the start of the Habitat chapter, and Mac is the orator of this duo. He's got a good speaking voice, so we'll chuck him on the excerpt, and then we'll expand on all the points.
Yeah, a little or not so little excerpt, but yeah, we think it's probably pretty key to give context to.
It's a good way to start
what we're about to explain, but he starts with a bit of an analogy. So imagine the moment of your birth, deep in prehistory, somewhere on the semi-wooded mosaic grasslands of Africa. Your tribe has been hunting and gathering with some success in recent years, and your mother is healthy, strong and active, right up until the moment of truth. The big day comes, and from the moment you leave your mother's body, you're exposed to a world of plants, animals, soil, and most importantly, perhaps, immense numbers of microorganisms. Almost instantly, they begin colonizing your body, and before long, they're multiplying, metabolizing, and forming countless chemical and genetic relationships with every cell in your body. In the days to come, Mum carries you from camp to camp in her arms or wrapped in an animal skin, which exposes you to yet more microbial life. If she's busy, she sets you down in the soft grass, and before long, you're crawling around, becoming ever more intimate with your habitat. Even when you begin to walk, you're still absorbing the living earth through your bare feet. As you grow, your physiology develops in tandem with your microbiome, and barring some major illness, infection, or predator attack, you'll grow up strong and healthy. Your habitat is not only on you, it's also in you. You are literally one with the biosphere. But microbes are just the beginning. In a natural setting, your bond with habitat is reinforced in every moment of every day. Natural light floods your eyes and even receptors in your skin, synchronizing clock cells throughout your body and keeping your physiology on track. The food you eat comes directly from your bioregion, and every bite brings your body into closer harmony with the physiology of the land itself. Sensation tightens the bond even further. Every touch of plants, animals, soil, and moisture is recorded directly onto your body and brain. By the time you reach adulthood, you will know your world in intimate, tissue-level detail. Sadly, this kind of origin story is almost unknown in our modern alien environment. Today we're born into sanitized settings that have no resemblance to our ancestral world. From the very beginning, the surfaces we touch are smooth and even sterile. The microbes we do encounter are from hospital cribs and gowns, and ecologically speaking, they're arbitrary. Later we go home to dwellings that are also isolated from natural light, textures, sounds, and soils. We may be several years old before we even have a meaningful contact with natural habitat, and for some people, the experience never occurs at all. It's no exaggeration to say many of us in the modern world are habitat and microbe deprived. It's no wonder our bodies and our minds are suffering. When habitat changes so radically, our intimate billion-year-old partnership with the microbial world is broken.
Powerful stuff. And I just love how that process of imagining and picturing yourself in a different context and essentially telling that story of how we would have experienced the world.
It hits home, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's more powerful than just explaining it. But he hits on so many points just in that story about, I guess, the difference between the modern environment and the ancestral environment. And it paints that picture of a ancestral environment as, quite wild and alive with, lots of bacteria and obviously animals and this dynamic, immersive environment that we're born into. And that understanding or that recognition of that environment as part of us. And, I guess in the new way, or in the modern world, we see the environment as quite separate. And this is a very new thing where we are literally part of the environment because we're animals. And
there's almost a layer of fear attached to exposure to that environment now.
This unknown wilderness, and it's dangerous. And of course, yes, it is of course nature can be dangerous, and there's a lot of, sure, bacteria can cause infections and animals can be predators, and, weather events can be very dangerous to health, but there are a lot of benefits to that sort of modern environment and some protection in that. But at the same time, that comes at a pretty big cost, having that separateness and that disconnection from nature as well, especially in the more chronic lifestyle disease related things that we've talked a lot about on the podcast before.
And it's probably not something you see in those early days. I mean, when you're a child and you're wrapped up in cotton wool and protected, and it's not parents' fault. I mean,
no.
Parents feel like they're doing the right thing for their kids by protecting them from that wild outside world. But it's hard to know the true toll or the true impact years and years down the track, and I guess the long-term impact on kids and adults.
Well, yeah, it's hard to know. I think it's hard to know the full degree of it, but there's certainly finding out more and more about how much that really matters. So there's, in the modern way, then we like to sterilize things and, get rid of all the bacteria as much as we can, and I guess concrete things make these urban environments that are easy to get around on and ride bikes on and drive cars on, and footpaths for us to walk on, and this whole landscaped area that again serves to deepen that separateness or that feeling of separateness and that view of the environment as other. And sure, we might go and visit nature and even thoroughly enjoy nature. A lot of people obviously love to get out in nature, but it's still that sort of like, oh wow, that's nature. It's that separateness, and you take a photo and be on your way, and chuck it up on Instagram. And
yeah, and I think even the word habitat itself, I remember when we were learning as children in schools about animals and their habitat and how important the role of an animal's habitat it plays in their survival. But us as humans, I don't think we would often use the word habitat to describe the place in which we live. There's a disconnect from that word itself, because I suppose it feels so far removed from nature. But really, we should be using that word as to describe the place that we live, and therefore adapting it.
Yeah, our language is more around our house, our neighborhood, our city, and so on. And yeah, if we start to view, actually, this is our habitat now. And sure, like we said, there's plenty of benefits to living in a city, especially sort of in that sort of short-term survival kind of concept. But acknowledging that our habitat has a very strong connection with our health is a really big step in the right direction of taking more control of our health and being more empowered about how we experience our health and our life. So I like the concept of biophilia, which is, I think, what Frank talks about in that book. He talks about how the modern understanding of that word, so biophilia is like the love of nature, or the like the affiliation with nature. But the modern understanding of that is like, oh, I love nature. Like there's furry animals and sunny days and creeks, and I've certainly fallen into that sort of that type of biophilia where it's like, oh, it's so amazing, and I love spending time out there. But the true sense of the word, and I guess the ancestral understanding, is more that kinship and affiliation with nature, and understanding that you're a part of it, and that if you die, then you go back into nature, and it's not the end of the world if you die or if someone dies, and it's part of the cycle of life. And I think there's a lot of problems that can come from that separateness,
that disconnect.
And
he puts it into good context as well, where he describes I guess wilderness as being a bit of a construct of our modern alien lives, and the way we describe going from the city into the wilderness, and the wilderness, like you said, being this dangerous unknown natural place with predators. And really, wilderness is, again, it's just a word we've used to describe, I guess, the contrast to the world that we've created.
Yeah, and I really like the analogy of, like, we've essentially created a zoo for ourselves, the self-created zoo, and we're all these zoo humans getting around in this very unnatural environment, and almost we have the freedom to go out into the wilderness if we want.
Yeah.
But we've created these mental barriers and psychological barriers to doing that. And I guess skill barriers as well, in that we just don't have the skills to survive in that natural environment anymore because we haven't been exposed to it. And an interesting thing with zoo animals is that there's plenty of research to show that they don't do very well health-wise. They start to get frustrated, and you'll observe them overeating or undereating and oversleeping, and signs of depression and mental instability, and a lot of other physical issues as well. And none of these are ever witnessed in animals in a wild or natural environment. And likewise with humans, when they study tribal populations who do live in that more ancestral way without haven't had contact with modern lifestyles, then they have they have basically non-existent rates of chronic lifestyle diseases, because yes, they may die more of infections and predation and things like that, and people will go, oh, well, they had a terrible life expectancy back in the day and all of that, but their quality of life and their quality of health and their connection with the land is so much deeper and so much better. And so one could argue that life expectancy is one thing, but that quality of life and that feeling of connection with your habitat is arguably a lot more important.
And I think something that really hit home for me when I was reading this chapter is the way that he describes the contrast between indigenous cultures and what, I guess, white man coming to this country and bringing our culture, or the cultures of European nations here to Australia. I mean, we often think of the damage that it's done to indigenous cultures, that arrival of white man, but in contrast, we probably don't often think about the damage that it did to the white man as well, and obviously on nowhere near as grand a scale. But we wonder why. I guess essentially we were never meant to live on this country. European settlers
displaced
themselves from the climate and their culture and brought themselves to a land, to an island.
Like you said, we can acknowledge and really see the effects of the trauma that we've inflicted by displacing Indigenous, not just in Australia, but all over the world. Indigenous and native populations have been horribly affected by the displacement and the disconnection from their land.
Being forced to move from their homes.
Which is a very deep issue, and we could talk probably for a whole podcast about the concepts of colonization and all of that. But it is it's a good thing to know that we've done that to ourselves in the same process of industrialization and colonization, is spread ourselves all across the world and been displaced from our natural habitat. And that's where a lot of these things, I mean, a good example is, the dangers of the sun, and
very much so. Yeah.
The sun is dangerous to us in Australia to a degree. I think it's very important to note that sunlight is good for you in the right dosage, but the levels of sunlight and UV and so on in Australia, our white skin, and especially those from highland or places where there was a lot of rain, like England and Scotland, and places where there's usually a lot of cloud cover and rain and not as much sunlight. Our skin essentially evolved in that environment, and now we're in a different environment, which doesn't have the same levels of sunlight. And so that's part of the confusion as to why is the sun dangerous? But it's down to what our genes, or the environment that our genes evolved in, and what our environment gets.
And we simply haven't evolved quickly enough yet to be able to withstand it. And I mean, it's not just the physical impacts, but I'm sure, it's hard to quantify, but the mental health impacts, the psychological impacts of being displaced.
I'd say displaced from our homeland, quote unquote, and which is sort of what Frank's getting at there, but also the displacement from nature by all of this technology that we've developed. And again, we're not really against technology. We're not against technology and having a house and so on.
Or recording a podcast into a computer with a phone filming it.
In this cushy apartment. But it's about just being aware of those effects and taking steps in your life to counteract some of those negative effects.
For sure.
So to get a little bit deeper on that, we're just going to talk about the health-habitat connection. And there's a few really good examples, but we'll just chat about, the basis for that health-habitat connection. And this really comes down to the study of epigenetics. And that is the study of how our environment affects the expression of our DNA. So for a good chunk of time, the understanding was that our genes determined, our genetic blueprint determined how we look, how tall we are, and how our eye color and hair color and all of these things about us. And the genes were that structure, and that also determined a lot of our health outcomes. So, heart disease is in my family, it's in my genes, and bunions, and, XYZ, you name it, that's just my genes. That was the sort of common understanding. And more recently, over the last few decades, there's been a lot more understanding and research coming out about how critical of a role the environment plays in the expression of our genes. So you can think about our genes or our genetic code as like the blueprint, and then that would be called our genotype, and then the expression of those genes, because certain genes can turn on or off, and that will change a lot about how our body is structured and function, how it expresses its structure and function, and that is basically called our phenotype. So the genes are the blueprint, and the expression is like the builder, or the actual expression of that blueprint.
Yeah, right.
And the environment plays a huge role on the environment. And I suppose our life experience plays a huge, in fact, probably a much bigger component on the overall result of that.
There you go.
So, especially when it comes to health, I think I like it. I just thought of an example before, actually, is just in terms of obviously genes will restrict certain capabilities and certain outcomes, and especially when it comes to congenital conditions, things that people are born with. But for example, we can't learn to breathe underwater because our genetic structure won't allow that. So we're not fish. Fish have a genetic structure and a genetic code that codes for having gills and a way to process oxygen through water. We don't have that. But what we can do is vastly improve our ability to interact with water and to hold our breath, and to, these mammalian dive reflexes and various things through exposure to water. So the challenges that we impose on ourselves through our lifestyle and our environment can vastly change the genetic expression. So it's just an interesting concept there. So of course there's limitations to genes. We can't do anything that we want by exposure to environment, but the exposure vastly changes the expression of those genes. So.
And I guess when you think of that in the context of how we live our lives, and then I guess you're suggesting that what we expose ourselves to really can change our health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've talked about a lot in the past about the mismatch hypothesis of where our genes evolved in a certain environment, a natural environment, a natural habitat, and we've very, in the terms of an evolutionary scale, we've very rapidly found ourselves in this zoo, this very mismatched environment where our sleep is very different, our exposure to light, which affects the sleep, our food is very different, our movement is very different and very lacking, and even our just relationship with community and everything is very different too. So that's pretty much the basis of that health habitat connection.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, the environment greatly influences our phenotype, or the expression of our genes, and we can look at the environment in two different ways. One is the internal environment, and I like to think about that as essentially the culture. Well, Bruce Lipton is the guy. I almost forgot his name. Bruce Lipton's like the father of epigenetics. He was one of the pioneers when it came to figuring out how stem cells change their action in response to being put in different culture mediums in a petri dish. And so then he talks about how our blood is like the culture medium of our body. And so he's written a book called The Biology of Belief, which I also highly recommend reading or listening to on Audible. But he talks about how our beliefs and our emotions and our mindset, which are all obviously very closely tied,
of course, will
affect the culture medium of our blood through the change in stress hormones and all of these, like neurotransmitters and things like that are influenced by our thoughts and beliefs. and emotions. And the culture medium of our blood then affects the health of our cells and the expression of our DNA within those cells. And so we've talked before about how stress and inflammation is so closely linked to every chronic lifestyle disease, mental and physical. And so that's what he's getting at essentially with the biology of belief, is that your beliefs and your perceptions on the world will directly influence your health through changing the culture medium of your blood.
And I think it's something that most people probably would understand. I mean, when it's explained, most people would think, okay, well, yeah, stress isn't good for me. But until it's actually made clear that can really seriously actually impact your health. I mean, for me, myself, in my former job, I was stressed a lot of the time and found myself getting sick quite often. And since removing myself from that environment, and being more aware, I suppose, of the impacts that stress can have on your health, and also having the mindset, I suppose, that when you do start feeling sick, not letting the idea of yourself getting ill perpetuate that illness and make it worse. A positive attitude and a positive mindset, it's hard to quantify, but you can feel it in your body, the positive impact that can have on your health.
Yeah, and it makes such a huge difference to how you recover. And then also just the knowledge of the fact that what you expose yourself to directly influences your immune system and everything, then that feeling of empowerment of, oh, I'm getting sick, okay, I need to start really looking after my diet and start sleeping more, and really what can I look at in my environment and lifestyle to help my immune system fight this off, rather than damn, I'm sick again, like it happens, why me, like I'm always getting sick,
exactly,
and so on. And that actually is bad for your immune system, which perpetuates that cycle. So yeah, it's a really good point. And I think you also found that, didn't you find that you started dreaming, or you started remembering your dreams for the first time
hugely
when you quit work?
And for someone who, like, I honestly didn't remember the last time I'd woken up and vividly remembered what I'd been dreaming about that night, and sort of figured that I maybe just hadn't been dreaming for the last, God knows how long. But yeah, the first week after leaving my last job, and removing myself from a situation that had built up stress in me, I remembered the dreams, and for 3 or 4 days straight, was waking up and remembering those dreams better than I ever had, or I can ever remember.
And that's a really good sign of sleep quality and sleep efficiency, and the fact that you're actually getting through some proper sleep cycles. Whereas, again, we know that stress, high levels of stress and chronic stress is very bad for sleep quality. And that's interesting feedback.
But I think the big issue is not enough value or weight is given to that, whether it's your lack of stress or the quality of your sleep. People don't value that enough. I know I didn't value it enough. Getting a good night's sleep and dreaming, or it's almost a badge of honor that we wear around. People love to say that I survived on 4 hours sleep last night, and I'm stressed to the hill. Like, it's
so
always
busy right
I'm
now.
so busy. Something my auntie once said to me. She runs a PR company down in Sydney, and very successful, and has led a very, very busy life. And she said to me a few years ago when I went down and caught up with her, she asked me how I was, and I said I've been busy, and she said, I'm really sick and tired of people telling me that they're busy. I never want to give that answer to someone again. I want to take control of that, and has really worked to change the way she runs her business to try and make people's lives a little bit less busy, her colleagues and herself, because there's this. It seems like it's this badge of honor to be the busiest person out there, but the negative impacts that can have, like actually on your health, not just mental but physical, probably isn't given enough weight.
Exactly. And if you're too busy to look after your health,
It flows
that's
on.
fine. That's fine for a certain amount of time, or fine. But it's eventually your body will force you to pay attention to your health, and it's sooner or later. Basically, you can either do it now and do it preventatively, or you can be forced to pay attention to your health later on with a health crisis.
So I guess that's the internal environment, but what would you say is the external environment?
Well, actually, a couple more things on internal.
Lay it on me.
A couple more. So we talked about sleep, and and recovery in general will greatly affect your internal environment. And as well, we've talked about movement in the past, so we don't have to delve too much into that, but that movement nutrient, so the contraction of your muscles and the movement of your lungs and diaphragm and all of these things will greatly influence the health of all of your bodily systems. And so if you haven't listened to that movement nutrition podcast, very, very worth listening to, because that's a very important concept. And the other part of the internal environment is the microbiome. And so this one, that's a huge rabbit hole as well, and probably deserves a whole podcast with a microbiome expert. But
and I'm not one.
No, neither. I've read a few books and listened to podcasts and so on. But the gist is that bacterial cells in our body and on our body vastly outnumber human cells. So some estimates are like 10 to 1. I've heard that might be a bit extreme, but basically there's way more bacterial cells in and on our body than human cells, and the type and diversity of those bacterial cells can vastly influence our health and function as well. And so, long story short, obviously digestion will be affected because a huge part of our gut and a huge part of our gut is the bacteria within there, and so a lot of that bacteria that I just mentioned sits within our gut, and so they're very involved in the digestive process and how much nutrients we can absorb, and so therefore the type of bacteria within there. This is why people take probiotics and stuff, and have you had your inner health plus today? Because sort of quote unquote bad bacteria or low diversity and of certain types of bacteria will affect your health negatively, but will also keep you wanting and craving certain foods like refined sugars and bad fats and so on. And so these bacteria, it's like who's controlling who, really. There's all these bacterial minds that outnumber our cells, and they want a certain type of something, and they can influence. It's been very well proven that they can influence your mood and your cravings and certain processes. So yeah, they're kind of driving you in a big way, which is pretty interesting.
It's a huge industry now, gut health. I mean, continuing to grow.
There's a lot of good books out there on it, and I mean, I know scientifically we're still really scratching the surface of what that relationship really means, but we know that it's super important, and it can also obviously affect your immune system in a big way, your mental health, related to your mood. Gut bacterial issues are closely linked with anxiety and depression, and also can affect your sleep quality and efficiency. So again, that's the internal environment. Obviously bacteria also exist everywhere in our external environment, so even the dichotomy between internal and external environments is almost a bit of a false dichotomy, because again, we're just part of our environment. But it's helpful to think about that a little bit, that dichotomy, so that you understand that both people often think of their environment as like everything outside of them, but your internal environment matters a lot as well.
And this comes back to what Frank is saying at the beginning of that chapter, and that exposure to the outside world from birth, and how important that is to building resilience and building resilience to the outside world.
And that's that hygiene hypothesis that we were talking about in the ground living episode, where if you sterilize everything and you never expose yourself to bacteria, then you don't get that microbiome, that diverse microbiome, which then helps all those other aspects of health. But it also if you don't get that diverse microbiome, then your immune system is compromised. And so now when you are exposed to things, you're more likely to get sick, and then it feeds itself.
And we're seeing more and more kids with allergies and
autoimmune conditions and all of these things that, skin conditions are also highly linked to bacterial problems within the gut and within the microbiome. So fascinating stuff. So the external environment, things like the weather and the climate are obvious examples. So we all know that sunlight, heat or cold will influence our genetic expression through, sweating or shivering. All of this is related. Sweating is a gene expression. Shivering is a gene expression. So the environment can vastly influence that. And it's been shown that, cold, wet, dark environments can predispose people to, I think it's seasonal affective disorder, like SAD. So it'll affect your mood, affect your mental health. And exposure to sunlight obviously is super important for vitamin D production and probably a whole host of other things that we haven't quantified yet, but we know that vitamin D is critical. So that external environment matters a lot. And another part of our external environment is our relationships with other humans and animals, I suppose, and pets and our community in general. And then and those relationships, again, plenty of studies to show that they are critical for health as well. And in fact,
hugely.
Loneliness is I think it's worse than smoking or equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of how much it increases your risk of all-cause mortality. So people who are lonely and don't have strong relationships with family or friends or community are, again, at much higher risk of health issues and much higher risk of dying, which is I mean, I'm going to say I was about to say it's pretty crazy, but it's not really when you think about it, because we're such social animals, and again, we evolved in an environment where those strong bonds and relationships with our tribe we depended on that for survival. And so just because now we no longer sort of quote unquote depend on that for survival in terms of getting food and protecting ourselves, doesn't mean that physiologically we don't need those bonds anymore. And again, you don't need research to tell you that having strong bonds with your family and friends feels really good. But it is interesting just how linked that is to long-term health. And obviously another part of the external environment, which quickly becomes our internal environment, is food and water. So
of course,
our food systems have obviously changed vastly, and the types of foods that we're eating in general in the modern world is very different to what we were eating ancestrally. And that's going to have a huge impact on our health, obviously, because our whole body is essentially made up of the building blocks that we take in through food, the nutrients that we take in through food.
And when you list all of these things in a long list, one of them would be enough to have a negative impact on your health. But when you pile all of these things on top of each other, food, water, relationships, lack of sunlight, and then the internal systems,
lack of movement, lack of diversity of the microbiome, poor beliefs and, stressful emotions,
of course we're going to be sick.
Yeah. It's suddenly we're not wondering why there's such an explosion of chronic disease. And of course, there's so many factors that go into that explosion of chronic disease. And there are some non-modifiable factors, which means, it's things that we can't change. And of course, there's socioeconomic factors and a whole heap of nuance. But the idea is that we do have a lot more control over our health and our environment than we think. And taking small steps to change that and to optimize that is really important. So speaking of steps and strategies.
Let's take some.
So in the book, in New Old Way, Frank talks about forest bathing, or Shinrin Yoku, so there was some studies done in Japan about basically just spending time in the forest and natural environments, and they've found that really beneficially influences our stress physiology, so the levels of stress hormones in our blood, markers of inflammation, our immune system health, blood pressure, and heart rate variability as well, which Tom and I talked about in the breathing podcast, but it's heart rate variability is essentially a measure of the distance between your heartbeats, and so or the rhythm of your heartbeat basically. And so if your heartbeat is quite variable, so say your heartbeat was like 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, then that's low heart rate variability. But if it was 1 second, 1.2 seconds, 1.6, 1.3, and it sort of varies, then that's actually a good sign of nervous system and whole body health, and of parasympathetic nervous system activity, which is that rest and digest nervous part of our nervous system that is so poorly lacking in most people, which is related to a stressful environment. So yeah, spending time in the forest is good for you. Again,
there you go.
You don't really need a study to tell you that feels good, but it's very cool to have research to show, it's physiologically, it's really good for you to spend time in nature.
It's funny you say that. We don't really need a study to back it up, but people don't believe it until until it's been researched.
Yeah,
and
people go, oh, wow, I should spend more time in
maybe
nature.
I should do it.
Yeah.
I knew it felt good, but
so
if the research is saying it's good.
Yeah, and it is, I think in this day and age, it does help to do research. And I love and appreciate that there are people going,
Absolutely.
all right, let's get some research so we can
back
show
it up.
people. And I do find I think it's always fascinating to look into that sort of more granular details of our physiology and how it's affected by certain environments. But yeah, it should really be the null hypothesis, or the common knowledge. Similar to barefoot, it's like, it's weird that we have to have research to prove that being barefoot is good for us.
Yeah.
Because that should just be the null. Like, of course it's good for us, or of course mechanically that makes the most sense, and physiologically that makes the most sense, because that's how we've evolved. And similarly with forest bathing, we've evolved in this environment. And I guess that's an interesting thing is it that the forest is healing, or is it that the civilization is like, it's this concept of nature deficit disorder or civilization excess disorder? It's really probably more indicative of the destructive power of the urban environment and all of the destruction of the land, rather than the healing power of nature, because those low levels of stress and the lower blood pressure and the improved immune function and all of these things are our natural state. And we've just taken ourselves out of that natural state, which is what we were talking about before. And related to the forest bathing, actually, I think, is the concept of awe. I found this really fascinating in the book, where the emotion of awe, as in feeling awe-inspired, is actually a very healthy emotion. And, if you imagine walking through a forest and you see a huge, big, beautiful tree with a whole heap of life within it, or a waterfall, a raging river, or a waterfall, or just the sheer power of nature, and something that makes you feel small, or maybe witnessing a storm off in the distance, or an amazing sunset or sunrise, and getting that feeling like, wow, that's actually very, very healthy for us. And again, they've done studies on this to show that that feeling of awe is actually associated with decreased inflammation and increased parasympathetic nervous system activity. And it makes people behave more ethically and generously, and describe themselves as more connected with other people and with their environment. And it makes them happier and less stressed. And I just find that really fascinating. And again, it makes sense because in a natural environment, we would be exposed to those awe-inspiring things all the time, and things that would make us feel small but connected as well. And in the new modern world, then we kind of don't like things that make us feel small. We're a bit scared of the storms, and we're a bit scared of, huge trees or something that might fall on us. Well, I don't know if that's a really good example, but you get the idea. We like to feel big. Our ego likes us to feel big.
Waves
and
in the ocean. You see giant waves,
and it makes sense. We want to be safe, but having those moments where we can really fully be present and experience the awe-inspiring
habitat in its purest form, really.
Yeah, and again, it's cool to know that that's good for us, and we should go and expose ourselves to things that are awe-inspiring. And a few more interesting, I'm calling them human zoo studies, which is basically, yes, you can look at the benefits of being immersed in nature and feeling that awe, but interesting couple of studies on, so there was one where in a hospital, rooms with views of natural and garden-like settings, patients in those rooms who were matched to patients in rooms that were, I think they were just facing brick. The patients in the garden, the views with the gardens and the natural settings, had shorter post-operative stays. They had fewer negative comments in the nurses' notes, and they took fewer analgesics than the other patients in the brick wall rooms, with no natural view. And they've also found that running on a treadmill while looking at rural pleasant scenes had better outcomes than urban unpleasant scenes, so better psychological outcomes and also lower blood pressure. And this is just literally just running on a treadmill.
Wow, yeah.
But the difference between looking at two different scenes.
Imagine if they ran outside.
Oh, I know. Crazy. And they've also found that there's a relationship between residential greenness, so I guess the presence of nature and plants and trees in residential areas, with birth weight. So they reckon that fetal development is beneficially influenced by greenness in the environment. So again, indicators of the closer you can get to a natural state of being and a natural environment, the better it is for all aspects of your physiology. So that brings us to, some environmental design, some things to do. So again, we've got, I guess, your local habitat and then your more global habitat. So your local habitat is the things we were talking about in terms of your home and your garden and your neighborhood. And so there are certain things that you can design, especially around your own home and garden, if you've got a backyard and everything, that can bring you closer to that natural state of being. So something that we've started to do is put a few more plants around everywhere. We're still kind of figuring out exactly how to keep them alive for long term, but one of them's up there is kind of struggling, but having plants around it's just very pleasing on the eyes, and again has been shown to be good for you as well. And so that's a good thing. Even just doing some of your own gardening in some way.
Interesting talking to Georgina this week, who's one of the foot nerds based in Melbourne, and I've been talking to her just recently about sharing her story, and we're going to get her on a podcast pretty soon as well.
We got her ebook. Actually, it's a great chance to plug her ebook, definitely, because it's epic. It's called Rewilding in Suburbia, and that's pretty much exactly what we're looking at here with this local habitat. Is yes, people live in the city. We can't all move out rural and move to the bush, but there are a lot of things that you can do in your city environment to simulate that, or to rewild a little bit in suburbia, which
and I don't want to steal her thunder because I'm sure she'll go into detail about it, but she was living off grid for several years, and with her two young boys, and then had to move back to the city because of work with her husband, and it wasn't until COVID, in the midst of COVID, when her boys were sort of trapped inside, having to study online and strapped to computer screens, for boys that used to catch a boat to school in Malakuta and were immersed in nature, to then have that real sort of closed in online environment. She freaked out. She couldn't stand watching them go through that, and wanted to ensure that A, they got outside more, but B, more families could live that way. And again, I don't want to steal her thunder, but what she's described of what she's been able to build at home with an aquaponics setup, and the fact that they grow their own fish to eat, and their own vegetables, and it's all a self-sustaining habitat that she's built in their backyard. It's so inspiring to see someone who is doing that in the heart of the city and is encouraging people to do the same. And we are far from that with what we're doing so far, but we're creating a space with Bush One where we'll be able to escape to go do that.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of going to be our second home at TFC Bush One, and a place where it's very immersed in nature, but in a sense a little bit of a retreat. But we'll plan to be growing our own food and building those skills, and then eventually starting up, I guess, more of a city-based or a closer to the city-based area where we can do more of that as well. It's pretty hard when you're in an apartment. I think we've had a few cracks at growing herbs actually, and the sunlight on our balcony is not ideal. It tends to kill things pretty quick, especially little fragile herbs. But even if you are in an apartment or somewhere that doesn't have much of a backyard, there's generally some way to find a way to get in touch with nature, whether it's, if you've got a good backyard, trying to grow your own food. If you've got minimal space, then getting some pot plants and learning to care for them. And you're not going to do it perfectly the first time, unless you're a genius, unless you're a natural green thumb. But the process of trial and error and doing your best to work with nature as much as you can in the environment that you've got is very rewarding. And that's just a really great way to do that. And I guess in terms of neighborhood as well, there's generally a lot of community gardens, and like the farmers market that we go to doubles as a community garden. It's called the City Farm, Northey Street City Farm Nursery, and it's such an epic place. And there's people that you grow your own food there in certain plots. And I know Richie from Perform 360, where we held a workshop there the other day, and have held multiple events there actually. It's an epic gym. Richie, he also runs community gardens in Mitchelton, and I know that they're around everywhere. And
I just connected with a group called the Mini Farm Project, who are again doing a similar thing where they build community gardens, and then all of the vegetables and fruit that they grow at the community gardens are then donated to charities. So there are plenty of options out there now, and more people are starting to do this sort of thing. But it's not just, I guess, the contact with nature that you get through that, but that comes back to the external environment and community and relationships that you build. Because I know when you walk through those markets and you get to interact with stall holders and just overhear conversations that people are having at stalls about where the food came from, or
and that deepens your relationship with food as well.
Yeah, it feels good.
It feels bloody good. And again, there are studies that show that community, the shared community gardens concept can be very, very good for mental health and depression and anxiety, and rebuilding that connection, like you said, not only with nature but with your community, and building those deeper relationships. And there's just so much in it, and so many variables, and probably heaps of variables that we don't even know about yet. But it's logical, it makes sense, it feels good.
I guess as well, there are things that you can add to your space to improve that environment, but there are things you can probably take away that
true.
You don't necessarily need. We used to have a TV that sat on this cabinet, and we haven't probably had it for a few months now, and haven't missed it.
Haven't missed it at all.
The microwave broke the other day, and we sort of had a conversation and decided, do we really need it?
Why do we even have a microwave? We occasionally heat up a hot beverage if it gets too cold.
We can work around that. Yeah. And how much better does it feel to have all that added bench space, but to not have a big microwave staring at you, or a big TV staring at you when you come into the living room, and to have plants instead.
And it seems like little subtle, almost insignificant things, but it actually makes a huge difference to how good you feel when you walk into the apartment. We've had lots of compliments as well. People come in, oh, geez, it looks nice in here. It looks different. Like, what do you change? Oh, no TV. Oh, it's a bookshelf with plants and a chessboard.
And there are still things that you need
Yeah.
to be able to function. Like, we're not saying start a campfire in the middle of your living room and get rid of the lights, but yeah, little things. If you look around your space and try and work out how you can adapt, because this is the habitat that your home is, the habitat that you spend most of your time in. To a large degree.
Yeah.
It's where you sleep, it's where you eat.
Mm.
So why not start there?
And you have the most control over what goes on in your home.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very good place to start. And then that would flow into, I guess, more our global habitat, which is, I guess, the condition of our country and then the earth in general. And when I say country, partly it's, our country is Australia or whatever country you're in. But when you think about the country, that's like, all the farms and the nature and all the places that aren't the city. Like there's the city and then there's the country. So I guess a huge part of what influences the country is our food systems. And so there's a lot of stuff coming out lately. I'm sure it's been coming out a lot, for a long time, but I guess we're delving a lot more into lately, and Mac has had some great experience with people, is the concept of regenerative agriculture. And so again, without that, it probably deserves its own podcast, and we do have a little bit of a plan to hopefully get someone on to chat about it. But the modern industrial process of agriculture and the way we farm food in this monoculture way, where we just have one single organism, say wheat or corn, grown on a huge plot of land, and that's the only organism that grows there, and we spray everything else, we kill everything else, because any pests or anything that might eat that crop that we want, we just kill. And what we're figuring out, or what the scientific community is figuring out, is just how terrible that is for the earth and for the soil. And soil health is actually probably the most important thing for environmental health, including climate change and global warming.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't until someone, I can't even remember who said it to us, but there's a big focus, I guess, now on sustainability.
It's
Felix, yeah, and Felix sort of said we can't just keep on focusing on sustainability, because we need to reverse what we've already done. If we continue to just sustain, we've already done a hell of a lot of damage up there, and down there, in the soil and in the atmosphere, and we need to reverse what we're doing, and we need to regenerate. The Echo Valley Farm.
Tell us a bit about that.
Out west of Brizzy, with my other business stories told, we went out and met the Breen family, Janita and Randall and their two kids, Eli and Bridie. And 7 years ago, they were social workers living in the city, and they just got jack of city life and decided they needed a break from that, and they bought a little block of land and decided that they were going to be farmers. They'd never farmed before in their life. They had no idea really what they were doing, but they wanted to take their approach to humans, and that's caring and supporting humans through their social work, and they figured it can't be too hard to apply that to the land and to animals, because they saw this need for someone to do something, and they wanted to be a part of that. And they bought 200 chooks, and then eventually chucked all those chooks in the back of a caravan and bought a bigger property at Goombara, near Warwick, just over the Great Dividing Range here in Queensland. And they've been able to build this regenerative farm. It's called agroecology, what Randall and Janita are doing. And they have pigs, they have cows, they have chooks, and all of the animals are constantly moving. They're moving from plot to plot to allow the soil to regenerate, to allow the manure from the cows to then be picked at by the chickens and then fertilize. The chickens fertilize the soil, and the pigs eat. It's called brewer's porridge. It's waste from a couple of brewers here in Brisbane, from two of our biggest breweries. They get free brewer's porridge from them, and the pigs eat that, and he calls them these sort of walking compost bins, and they work in harmony, and it's working. They have a community of customers that they supply monthly their meat and eggs, and
which will soon include us.
Yes, we've jumped on board because it was just so eye-opening to see what they were doing, and they were so passionate about what they were doing because they realized how important their habitat was, and not just for the goodness of the earth and for saving the planet and caring for the animals, and they say they've got 4 goods, and their 4 goods are: is it good for the land? Is it good for the animals? Is it good for the farmer? And is it good for the consumer? And it's in that order that they make every decision on that property: the land and animals first, and then the farmer and consumer second. And if it ticks all of those boxes, then they'll do it. But yeah, it's not just for the good for the greater good, but it's for the good of their children too, and for the good of their family. They work 90-hour weeks, both of them. The family's taken 1 holiday off the farm in 7 years, but their kids were the most genuine, inspirational young kids, both teenagers, and who are more than happy to be working on the land and have a genuine affinity with the land that they live on.
Yeah, and the animals, because it's a way of life, really. It's fine. That's such a deep connection with the earth, and just really understanding and respecting that the earth is an ecosystem, and you can't just monoculture farm one organism. It's the interactions of all these organisms with the plant, animals with the plants, with the soil, that actually creates the ecosystem that we need. And it's the opposite of that, the monoculture, that is actually destroying ecosystems and destroying monoculture that could be of grains and whatever, or it could be the factory farming, these practices where it's, we're only gonna grow cows here, and we're gonna feed them all these grains, versus the cows are gonna eat the grass and the pigs are gonna eat the compost and all of these things, and they all work together to feed into each other. And there's a really, really, I highly recommend watching Mac's story on the Echo Valley Farms.
We'll
Stories Told.
We'll chuck a link in the show notes,
and also a more long form, very inspirational documentary is called Kiss the Ground on Netflix, and that really goes deep into all of that and showing that yes, regenerative agriculture takes time and patience and skills to learn, but it actually can be far more, it's far better for not only the land but also for the farmer, and in terms of, I guess, connection to the land and the animals, but also financially can be really rewarding as well, because you get better produce and you get people who really care about you supporting you.
And I guess if people haven't seen that or know how it all works, the idea is that soil is really, a carbon sequestering machine, and Randall sort of says it in the story that we could spend millions and millions of dollars trying to develop a machine that can suck all of the carbon that we put up in the atmosphere back out, but they already exist, and that is soil and plants in the soil. That relationship is the only way that we can reverse the impacts that we've had. And like you just said, I mean, there is, I think, this big belief that, is it too far gone? Do we have enough time to reverse all of this? And that, I guess, leads to another story that I've done, funnily enough, with a guy called Habitat Matt, and his company Habitat. He was a stunt actor who was working at a 7-Eleven, who 2 decades ago decided, bugger this, I'm going to get out there and do something for the planet. And he started this company, and what he does is when developers or mining companies come through, and they obviously clear land, and we could argue until the cows come home, the negative impacts that's having, but they have an obligation as part of that to restore some of that land. And Habitat Matt is the guy that they get in to do it. And what he has developed over the last 2 decades is a system, or I guess an approach that he's fine-tuned that he calls rapid rehabilitation. And what he does is essentially uses modern agricultural techniques to regenerate cleared land. And there's a place at Pimpamar on the northern Gold Coast, Gainsborough Greens. He had a 48 hectare block, I believe, that was completely desert. It was barren dirt. There was nothing there. And I mean, we've got the drone pictures and you can see them in the story, but he's been able to turn this completely cleared block in 7 years into a thriving ecosystem by using these modern agricultural techniques to essentially sow thousands and thousands of seeds and just let it go. It took him 5 days, and him and his team 5 days to put all these seeds out there. Made sure he was putting the right ones out there and understood the environment and the landscape and what would work and what wouldn't. And now they've had people from the Queensland Herbarium come out and test it and have found that there are enough native animals and wildlife and flora and fauna there to class it as an endangered ecosystem. So it's gone from extinct to endangered, and that's only going to improve in 6 years. They haven't been able to class it as an endangered ecosystem yet because under the rules in Queensland, it has to have been that way for 10 years to class it as that. But they can't believe that he's been able to do this in such a short period of time. And what he says is, we just need to get out there and do it. It's possible to reverse extinction if we just have the right mindset and the right approach and we give it a crack. And it doesn't have to be sowing tens of thousands of seeds on a 48 hectare block. It can be as simple as going once a month to a tree planting day with a community organisation and planting a tree. If you plant 20 trees once a month for 4 years, I think he said, you're being in awe of what you're able to achieve.
Especially if a lot of individuals did the same thing. If everyone believed they could make a difference and everyone planted 20 trees a month, or like 10,000 people planted 20 trees a month, suddenly that scale gets huge. And speaking of planting trees, actually we spent, I think it was maybe last month, we spent a good day with Reforest Now, which is our partners who plant trees based on how many beams we sell. So now, in the interest of not just sustainability but regeneration, each beam we sell plants 2 trees with Reforest Now, which is amazing. And we've actually been donating to them since we launched the timber beams, which is about a year now. And
so over 250 trees?
Over 250 trees, which is cool. Again, a small amount, but better than 0 trees, and can only keep going up.
And they're being planted here in Australia, which is awesome.
Right, pretty much in our backyard down in Byron Bay, and I think they do some in the Daintree as well. And anyway, we were... Obviously, COVID heavily restricted our ability to do any of those planting days, but we saw an opportunity last month to go down, and we were really keen to get our hands dirty. But it was even better than we expected, really. It was, first of all, it was very inspiring to spend time with Maximo Botaro, who's the founder of Reforest Now, and he really has got some knowledge about ecological restoration.
Stuff, and he's not a CEO in a suit. He was drilling the holes to plant these thousands of saplings. Bloody inspiring dude.
He's out there in the thick of it, doing it all, and pumping his tunes and geeing everyone up. Yeah. And he had a good chat with us, and Mac also did a story on him, which
that'll be airing this Friday.
This Friday. Perfect timing. But they take volunteers. They're always open to people going on and helping, and we're definitely going to be going down for more of those tree planting days because it's so satisfying.
It's a double win, because not only are you helping the habitat by obviously planting trees, but it comes back to that awe-inspiring, the benefit of the awe, because I was in awe the whole day. It felt so good to have your hands in the earth and be getting dirty, and to be surrounded by other people who had taken time out of their Fridays to to do this as well.
Yeah, and you're getting, thousands of reps of squats going and split squats and, farmers carries and all this exercise or all this movement. And it's for a purpose. It's task driven and it's for a good purpose. And we came out of that day just feeling so fulfilled and so keen to do more. And again, it's not about quitting your day job and going and planting trees every day, although that's a possibility, I think, by actually working for them. But, just taking one day a month or one day a quarter to volunteer your time and go and do that. And it's not really about sacrificing your time to do that. It's about choosing to prioritize that time in nature and that time helping to regenerate our landscape in our own backyard, because it's good for us, but it is so important for the environment and our climate. And again, it's still kind of selfish, because we need the climate and the environment to continue surviving as a human race. If our food systems and soil, if the way that is going, if it keeps going that way, we're not going to be able to sustain. It's just not sustainable.
Yeah.
And so in one sense, it's good. We're putting ourselves out there for the good of the environment, but you can also view that as selfish in a good way, that yes, we actually want to keep living and we want our children or our future children to be able to live on this planet, and their children and so on. And I mean, we've heard this message 1,000 times, and I think, people aren't sick of it, but you hear this message and you go, well, what can I really do? This is a great place to start.
Yeah.
Go and plant some trees, connect with Reforest Now or Habitat Mat, or support a local regenerative agriculture, CSA.
Go to a farmer's market.
An
organic farmer's market.
Yeah. And connect with your food system, connect with your environment, understand and respect nature, get more nature time in your daily life or in your weekly life or whatever. And little things add up. If everyone did that, it'd make a huge, huge difference. So we're not perfect. We're still figuring it out. We're still
like how to keep these plants alive.
But there's perfection in progress, and we're looking for ways to progress our connection with nature in that way, and we're going to keep doing it, and we'll keep sharing our journey along the way, and hopefully as a community we can all make a real difference.
Absolutely. It's probably a good place to finish up.
Sounds good. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Cheers, guys.